Greetings. I'm Brother Judah from the Congregation of Israel and a representative of the NMP, the Nazarene Messianic Party. I'm your host today, and I'd like to welcome all of the listeners to What Is to Be Done podcast. Here we deal with geopolitical, historical, biblical, social, and other scientific content. We approach the Bible from a social political perspective, and we argue this is the appropriate way to approach the Bible because the Bible deals with kings, nations, empires, civilizations, societies. In short, it deals with political science and politics. And I want to continue a discussion and a critique analyzing a debate between Chad O. Jackson and Delano Squires. As I said before, the entire debate, most high willing, will be in the description box where you can hear the entire debate without interruption. One of the reasons why I want to deal with this is because it's going to, what I believe, establish some arguments that we make in our classes. And that is, the race doctrine could be misleading. Just because a person is of your same race doesn't mean that they're your brother or that they have your best interests. And it boils down to our fundamental beliefs, our values. So in this debate, we have Delano Squires and Chad O. Jackson. They are debating whether the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King was a benefit for Black people in America as a whole. So let us bring them in so we can get an idea on what we're working with here.
I still have a dream.
And Chad's response is, well, of course you would say that. He's a Marxist.
In fact, he slept with two women who weren't his wife the night before he died.
That one day, this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed.
The issue is never the issue. The issue is the revolution.
That's part of what we do. We air our grievances.
Free at last! Free at last! Thank God Almighty, we are free at last!
Welcome to the Harmony Channel. I am Jason Whitlock, your host. Happy MLK Day to those who celebrate. It is Martin Luther King Jr. Day across America. We wanted to have a special conversation about Dr. King's legacy because it is now being questioned. Is it a force for good, force for bad? Is it necessary? And so I've invited two guys familiar to my audience, Delano Squires and Chad O. Jackson, to have a conversation with me today about MLK, his legacy, his importance.
So this is where we're picking it up. And this was hosted by Mr. Jason Whitlock. And again, the link to his channel to view the entire debate without interruption will be in the description box. Now, as I had stated before, our focus is Chad O. Jackson. Chad O. Jackson is arguing that the civil rights movement and MLK was not a force for good for Black people and America as a whole. On the contrary, to our right, we have Delano Squires, who's arguing that it was a force for good and yielded benefits. Now, I want to focus on Chad Jackson because Chad Jackson he's going to bring out um, rhetoric or propaganda. And when I'm saying rhetoric or propaganda, I'm not necessarily, it's not good or bad, these words. Propaganda isn't bad, it's neutral. Rhetoric isn't bad, it's neutral. So the rhetoric is the idea to use words in such a way in which you can convince people. So we all have rhetoric, we all have propaganda. The key is the undergirding of the information. What is it based on? Is it based on truth? I'm arguing from Philip Randolph. He argued that the bourgeois libel, and that's what we have here, Chad Jackson, bourgeois libel of the civil rights movement. And I am running on a comment made by Philip Randolph, in whom Chad Jackson is going to make mention of. And Philip Randolph argued, he used this word libel. It was the Western propagandist libel or defamatory language. This language or statements or a representation of defamation. And so we have this here for the civil rights movement. Now, all of this ties into the Bible, whether people believe it or not. However, if you are of the religious persuasion, and what I mean by religious, I'm using religious in the context of modern day religion. If you are of the modern day religion perspective, then you might not see the connection with the scriptures. But our class and our school argues from a social political perspective and analysis and study of the Bible. And this is very important for the overall argument we make with the messianic concept, the battle between the nations, the battle of Armageddon, the war of words, the sword proceeding out of the mouth. This language that's used in the Bible that speaks of a confrontation between the powers of darkness and the powers of righteousness. And righteousness in Greek and Hebrew is a synonym to justice. And so in essence, this is what we're looking at. The civil rights movement was a struggle for justice. And this struggle for justice is going to be called into question. And it's called into question from those who seek the bourgeois way of life. When we're making reference to the bourgeois, it is the property class, the capitalist class, aristocratic class. And Chad Jackson gives hints that he is a Christian. And this debate is going to lead also into the Bible to further our point and our position with the scriptures. But it's going to lead into the Bible when they're going to get to talking about the Bolsheviks, the USSR, and thus and such. So as I was explaining, Philip Randolph argued that the West was using libel or defamatory language against the Soviets, the USSR. So this is the second session, and we covered some things in our first session with this debate pertaining to the language that Chad Jackson was using. I'm going to let it play again from the beginning, and then we're going to pick it up where we left off as we begin to critique Chad Jackson's arguments of the communists or the Soviets was their ideology was contrary or antithetical. And he used the word antithetical, which carries this meaning of something that is in direct opposition to your fundamental position. And he argued that communism is antithetical to their conventional values, or he said conventional means. And it is antithetical. And he also used the word, it was hostile. He argued that the communist ideology was hostile to their conventional means of success. And so we start to question, what is this success? What is it based on? And so if we were just to take a moment, for example, to look into a passage, because this passage in the book of Proverbs in particular, we want to look into. All right. Proverbs 31. We want to look at Proverbs 31. And I'm not sure if all three men on the panel confess to be Christians. I'm not sure, but it appears that Mr. Whitlock is a Christian, and also Chad O. Jackson. I'm not sure about Delano Squires. But now let's analyze just this passage here in context, or in light of what we're going to be examining in this debate. Proverbs 3:31, the text reads, "Envy thou not the oppressor, and choose none of his ways." Again, Proverbs 9:31. "Envy not the oppressor, and choose none of his ways." Now, seeing that this Proverbs and these words of wisdom are associated with a political leader, namely Solomon, that phenomenon is something that was noticed and has been noticed throughout history, is that the oppressed envies the oppressor, and they choose the ways of the oppressor. And let me just add another witness to this, so people can understand this position, or what happens among people in a society. And we want to look at another text, Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. Since you are not to envy the oppressor and choose none of his ways, let us look further into the teaching of the oppressed. Because remember, the context of the civil rights movement is a context of people struggling against oppression and injustice. So we have oppression and injustice present in a society, and there is this tendency for a segment of society to envy the oppressor and want to be like them. So let us look at this again with Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So the passage again, Proverbs 3:31, that was out of the KJV. And the KJV is what we used to That was the passage or the version. And just keep in mind what we have read and the wisdom of the passage. Envy not the oppressor and choose none of his ways. Now let's look at this phenomenon. And again, I want the people to have this background as we investigate this debate. If we're looking now at Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire, and in this edition, this would be page 47 of chapter 1. Paulo Freire argues, he says, thus the behavior of the oppressed is a prescribed behavior, following as it does the guidelines of the oppressor. The oppressed, having internalized the image of the oppressor and adopted his guidelines, are fearful of freedom. And this is definitely argued when you're looking at this antithetical threat that the Soviet pose to Chad Jackson and who he represents. The Soviets are arguing freedom for all men. Okay? But Chad Jackson is arguing that this sentiment of the Soviets, again, this sentiment of the Soviets was expressed when we look at the Ku Klux Klan flyer. Negroes beware, do not attend communist meetings. Why? The Klan spelled it out. What were the communist ideas and intentions? Freedom. And the stairway to freedom is social equality and equity. So we said pay organizers. The Klan argued, and these are government officials. Now, most people know just a little bit of historical research. You know, government officials and everyone else was sitting in the Klans. It was former generals and people who were part of the ruling class of the slavocracy that formed the Klan, who were men of power and means of the Democratic Party, political party. So these were political officials. They formed the Klan. And they argued paid organizers for the communists are only trying to get Negroes in trouble. Alabama is a good place for good Negroes to live in, but it is a bad place for Negroes who believe in social equality. The Ku Klux Klan is watching you. Take heed. So the basis of the civil rights movement and the Bolsheviks or the communists is social equality. Ultimately, it is freedom. This was the slogan: freedom, land, and bread. All right. So Chad Jackson, whether knowingly or ignorantly, is arguing for the antithesis of freedom. He's arguing to keep a social economic system in place that has enslaved everything to get his hands on for profit. All right. And thus we have those who are being exploited by the oppressor. They are enslaved. And what embodies this type of situation is the behavior of the oppressed is a prescribed behavior. It isn't inherent in the people. It's prescribed. following as it does the guidelines of the oppressor. They're following the pattern of the oppressor. What the oppressor prescribes, they follow. The oppressed, having internalized the image of the oppressor and adopted his guidelines, are fearful of freedom. One reason is Paulo Freire says freedom is acquired by conquest. All right. So when we see the freedom rides, the freedom struggle, we're talking conquest. Martin argued the same thing. Freedom isn't voluntarily given. It must be demanded by the enslaved or the oppressed. Okay. So what we're looking at is that the oppressed have this tendency to pick up the behavior of the oppressor, just as what Proverbs 3:31 warned us. The envy not the oppressor and choose none of his ways. Now, Paulo Freire continues. He says, they are at one and the same time themselves and the oppressor. He's talking about the oppressed. The oppressed are one and the same time themselves and the oppressor, whose consciousness they, which are the oppressed, have internalized. And I'm arguing that Chad O. Jackson is representing a class of people who have internalized the behavior and the values of the oppressor. So what the oppressor calls success, this is what they call success. So I'm bringing in the question what Chad O. Jackson is calling success. Now, this is going to be an impossible hurdle to reconcile based on biblical principle. Now, it's one thing arguing, when I mean argue, I mean discussing with people who don't regard the Bible. But it is an advantage for an evangelist who deals with social political narratives to use the Bible and the biblical principle from a social political perspective in their discussions with those who are claiming to believe the Bible. Now, the Bible says, envy not the oppressor. We know we have a segment of people oppressed. The question is whether the Soviets and Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement was a benefit. And we have Chad O. Jackson saying they wasn't. And now we have to bring into question whether Chad O. Jackson and whom he represents envies the oppressor and desire his ways. That is the oppressor ways. Going back to pedagogy of the oppressed. Moving forward to page 61. Page 61 of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And Chad O. Jackson, his arguments seem to line up with what Paulo Freire warned. He says one of these characteristics is the previously mentioned existence or the previously mentioned existential duality of the oppressed. This duality is the oppressed who are at the same time themselves and the oppressor, whose image they have internalized. And then he continues concerning the oppressed. On the other hand, at a certain point in their existential experience, the oppressed feel an irresistible attraction towards the oppressors and their way of life. So this is what Proverbs is warning us about. Envy not the oppressor and don't desire any of his ways, because in this condition of oppressed and oppressor, we have the oppressed, as Paul Freire says, the oppressed feel an irresistible attraction towards the oppressor and their way of life. Sharing this way of life becomes an overpowering aspiration. It's overpowering. Your desire for it is overpowering. This great desire, this irresistible attraction to be like the oppressor. The oppressed want at any cost to resemble the oppressors, to imitate them, to follow them. This phenomenon is especially prevalent in the middle class oppressed, who yearn to be equal to the eminent men and women of the upper class. This irresistible, he said, this phenomenon is especially prevalent in the middle class. Especially prevalent in the middle class. And so this is why we were saying what we were saying with our close of the last session. We were looking at the businessmen who made it to the so-called middle class, upper middle class. And it says black businessmen and religious leaders. This is a text out of Robin D. Kelly work, Hammer and Hoe. In fact, most high willing, we will have a link in there for that text if you want to see if you could purchase it. Black businessmen and religious leaders made their fortunes from the consumer base of working class blacks. Ensured peaceful relations by creating alliances with white industrialists. And a handful secured enough, quote, respectability, unquote, to retain the franchise. Like the white elite, like the oppressors, not white men in general, but the white elite capitalists, this group of black businessmen mimicked them. Like the white elite, they maintained their own exclusive social clubs and rarely interacted with the poor blacks. And that's why Martin argued in his book, Why We Can't Wait, that the middle class Negro who benefited from segregation because the black dollar was monopolized, and that's how they built their fortunes, because the black people couldn't spend nowhere else. This black middle class who envied the oppressor, this black middle class became insensitive to the condition of the masses. This is exactly the mentality of the oppressor. This is the way of the oppressor. They are insensitive to the sufferers. And our friend Chad O. Jackson is going to actually demonstrate this lack of sensitivity to the masses by using this language that the civil rights movement exploited. The USSR and the civil rights movement exploited grievances. And then he began to categorize these grievances by saying they were feel sorry for me grievances. Like the people didn't have legitimate grievances while they were oppressed. But if you have become desensitized and insensitive to the oppressed, then you can't relate. And the oppressor can't relate. And those who desire his ways develop his psychology. Exactly what Paulo Freire was explaining. So we're going to follow up with this background and see what category that Chad O. Jackson falls in and who he represents. Proving our point, it's not about white or black. This is a class struggle. It's always been, you see. And before you know it, you think someone is on your side because they black and they saying, we have this, black businesses had that, Black Wall Street this, the Carolinas business district had that. No, the rich blacks had that. While they built their fortunes off poor people, poor black people. Okay. So old Gurley, same thing. Businessman, capitalist to the core, who exploited the propertyless black freedmen for his own means, for his own gain. So he represents a different class. So does Chad O. Jackson. Let's get back to this.
I still have a dream.
And Chad's response is, well, of course you would say that. He's a Marxist.
In fact, he slept with two women who weren't his wife the night before he died.
That one day, this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed.
The issue is never the issue. The issue is the revolution.
That's part of what we do. We air our grievances.
Free at last! Free at last! Thank God Almighty, we are free at last!
All right, so we're going to get into this. We're going to pick it up with their, we looked at their intro, and we want to pick it up with Chad O. Jackson as he began to talk and express his position. All right. So with this in mind, let us look into the or listen to the arguments of Chad O. Jackson. And again, we are not, this isn't to be derogatory towards the person. We're just talking about his ideology. And none of us was, well, I can't speak for everyone, but many will argue none of us are just born with the truth. We have to search for it. And so there were just different times. As of now, many of us are ignorant on different subjects, and we are looking and searching. And so who knows? Maybe Chad may change his position in the future. He may not. I don't know. But right now, we're just looking at his argument. So this isn't no personal attack against Chad O. Jackson. But let's listen to his arguments in light of what we looked at and analyzed from Proverbs and from the phenomenon of the oppressed envying the oppressor.
The matter is that the civil rights movement and King were not afforded.
Let us go back just a touch so we can hear it from the beginning.
On race.
Delano, good opening statement. Chad, I do want to, before you go, I want to advise you, you can rebut what Delano says after you give your opening statement. So your opening statement doesn't have to be a direct rebuttal to what Delano said. Just so let me restate the question. We'll restart the clock here. Was Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement a force for good or a net negative for America in general and black people in particular?
Well, the truth of the matter is that the Civil Rights Movement and King were not a force for good. Really, what they were a force for federal expansion and the USSR propaganda. The USSR, the Soviet Union, literally called the Civil Rights Movement in America the strategic propaganda asset, because that's exactly what they were. When you look at King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, there was a direct line and an indirect line of communication between them and the Soviet Union. This goes back to the 1930s under the FDR administration, where you had the National Negro Congress, which was started by a commission out of the FDR administration and Joseph Stalin himself.
Now, we explained in our first session the language, so we're not going to get into it today, but the language of the civil rights movement being a strategic propaganda asset. We explain that what propaganda means is just a conveying of ideas. And strategically, the civil rights movement was a platform for the Soviet Union to convey their ideas, not infiltrating in a bad sense like Chad O. Jackson's explaining, but being in solidarity with the African American people, because the Soviets or the Russian people had just experienced Jim Crow themselves under the czars. So they had empathy and they wanted to have solidarity with this movement of civil and human rights. So we discussed more of that in our first session. So if you want to hear our reply on that, go back to our first session, and then it'll probably catch you up. But right now we want to get to the other aspects of Chad O. Jackson's argument pertaining to the exploitation of grievances and thus and such. All right, so much of this we have covered already. So let me let him continue.
The matter is that the Civil Rights Movement and King were not a force for good. Really, what they were a force for federal expansion and the USSR propaganda. The USSR, the Soviet Union, literally called the Civil Rights Movement in America the strategic propaganda asset, because that's exactly what they were. When you look at King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, there was a direct line and an indirect line of communication between them and the Soviet Union. This goes back to the 1930s under the FDR administration, where you had the National Negro Congress, which was started by a commission out of the FDR administration and Joseph Stalin himself. A. Philip Randolph was the leader of that organization. And by the time you get to the 1960s, he would hand the baton off to Martin Luther King. And so there has always been communist infiltration in the civil rights movement, and it didn't change under Martin Luther King's leadership. I argue that this is a force for bad and is a detriment to Black Americans and to America at large, insofar that the communist ideology is antithetical to our way of life. It's antithetical to genuine success. I know Delano writes a lot about family values. He writes a lot about conventional methods and means to becoming successful. Communism is antithetical and downright hostile to those conventional means that my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents undertook to become successful. Whether you're talking about in rural Arkansas, whether you're talking about in rural Oklahoma, where my folks are from, or in Texas.
So pay attention to this conventional means to become successful. We started to question, well, what is success? Now keep that in mind, because we looked at earlier this envy of the oppressor and to desire his ways. So the value system of the persons must be evaluated. So when Chad is saying success, what does he mean? Is it the oppressor's standard of success? Or is it the oppressed standard of success? So keep that in mind. This idea of the communist being antithetical and hostile to the conventional means that his parents and grandparents undertook to become, quote, successful, unquote. Okay. Now he's going to bring something else out as well, and that is the to exploit grievances. And the rhetoric he's going to bring with the exploiting of grievances is that the grievance was a feel sorry for me grievance. And this is a fallacy.
Where I live now, when you look at this notion of what Marxism breeds in terms of exploiting grievances, as Thomas Sowell documents, as well as the late Walter E. Williams and other scholars, you saw this kind of upward mobility, this upward trajectory on the part of colored people from the 19th century well into the 1940s and 50s.
Okay, so this is what we want to look at. The argument that it is the communists who undertakes this position to exploit grievances, and that he's seen or heard or gathered from Thomas Sowell argument and others that it was this upward mobility for Negroes at the turn of the century up to the 1950s. And he's going to bring in this upward mobility. He's going to allude to the fact that it entailed this economic development, business, until the Soviets came in, infiltrated the civil rights movement with their propaganda. And the Soviets' propaganda was instrumental in developing this feel sorry for me grievance and bitterness. So he's going to blame the bitterness that the Negro expressed in the civil rights movement. In essence, essentially, he's arguing it came from the Soviet propaganda, instead of historically acknowledging that the grievance of the so-called Negro and his bitterness, it was brought out during the civil rights movement, because that's when the Negro had a platform. Other than that, the Negro did not have a platform, and he was threatened with violence or job loss or social murder if he was the voice how he really felt. This is what Chad O. Jackson totally left out, but we talked about it in our first session. But let's give an example of the grievances and how he blamed exploiting grievances was a communist thing. The reason why that is not accurate is because all you have to do is look into the Declaration of Independence. It's a list of grievances. In fact, Chad O. Jackson is going to be confronted with this juxtaposition of the grievances and the revolution, so-called revolution of the civil rights movement, and the revolution of the 13 colonies from Britain. So when you look at the entire debate, Delano Squires is going to bring that out. And it's going to be a difficult question for Chad O. Jackson to address. So I'm not going to address that aspect as far as, yes, the 13 colonies had a revolution against the British Crown, and they had a list of grievances that they used to persuade the people, or they used their list of grievances as rhetoric to gather the people together and the militia together to go against the crown. So it's not a communist thing. And again, I don't know if he don't know that or if he's just being disingenuous. But there's another grievance, and I want to bring this one out as well to show how to say exploiting grievances is something that all do. In fact, Chad Jackson is using the grievance of the bourgeois class as a platform for his argument against the civil rights movement. All right. He said the civil rights movement is antithetical and it is downright hostile to their conventional means that leads to success. And so therefore he's presenting his argument or his propaganda and trying to exploit the grievances of those who believe in business and trying to get those who believe business is the salvation. How they believe business is essential for the development of the so-called Negro. He's trying to use this language to go against the communists and get all those who believe that circulating the black dollar or black business is the way to economic development and justice or equity. So he's just going to exploit the grievances that the capitalists have against the communists. It just so happens the grievance that they exploit, most of it is lies. But here's another grievance. This is out of a text or capitalists exploiting a grievance. Of a text, American History in Black and White, David Barton. And here on page 32, David Barton explains how, again, to go against Lincoln and the freedom of slaves, the capitalist, democratic capitalist class is going to exploit the grievance of the property class and try to use their grievances to persuade them to go against Lincoln. So this isn't a communist thing. This is something that people do to convey their ideas. And so we have here on page 32, and I believe this is from Colonel Fletcher Webster. No, this isn't. No, he is an abolitionist. But let us go down a little bit here and find out a few things about a little exaggeration on Chad's end to make it seem like the exploitation of grievances or using grievances as a way to convey your ideas is just a communist thing. So we're looking at General George McClellan, who ran for president. He was a Democrat. A Northern Democrat, if I understand correctly, General George B. McClellan. And look at McClellan, which is a Northern capitalist Democrat who's going to use grievances to further his campaign against those who were fighting for justice or the abolition of slavery, in which the senators argued at that time in the 1850s and 1860s that slavery was an evil in the body politic. Now, General George McClellan argued in 1864 in an 1864 campaign piece for General McClellan. He urged citizens to vote for him because, as he explained, our bloody war has now lasted nearly 4 years under the mismanagement of Abraham Lincoln. Nearly 1 million white men have been sacrificed. So we see he's exploiting the grievances of those in the South, those who are losing loved ones in the war. In fact, it was the implementation of income tax too to support the war and troops. So he was exploiting these grievances that the people had to rally around him to remove Lincoln. So again, it's not an honest position to argue that the communists like to exploit grievances. We have capitalists doing it all the time. And if your grievance is square and is just, then you voice your grievance. But Chad is making it seem like it is a bad thing. So this was General McClellan arguing for his presidential election. So vote for General McClellan. All right, so he argued nearly 1 million of white men and 4,000 millions of dollars have been sacrificed. We were told at the outset by Mr. Lincoln and by Congress that the war was to be prosecuted for the purpose of maintaining the Union and the authority of the Constitution as against the armed rebellion. And so he goes on with his rhetoric to use the grievances of the South and grievances of the North to go against Lincoln in the war to free the slaves. So to argue that the communists exploit grievances is it's not honest, Chad. It's not honest. Now let's continue to listen to him, because he's going to get into this upward mobility in the 1950s of, he appears at least to be alluding to this type of economic development. So let us listen to him get into this, all right? This type of economic development.
Into America at large, insofar that the communist ideology is antithetical to our way of life. It's antithetical to genuine success. I know Delano writes a lot about family values. He writes a lot about conventional methods and means to becoming successful. Communism is antithetical and downright hostile to those conventional means that my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents undertook to become successful. Whether you're talking about in rural Arkansas, whether you're talking about in rural Oklahoma, where my folks are from, or in Texas, where I live now. When you look at this notion of what Marxism breeds in terms of exploiting grievances, as Thomas Sowell documents, as well as the late Walter E. Williams and other scholars, you saw this kind of upward mobility, this upward trajectory on the part of colored people from the 19th century well into the 1940s and 50s. And then as this...
So notice the upward trajectory, this upward mobility from the turn of the century to the 1930s to the 1950s. We're going to investigate that, see what the numbers say.
When you look at this notion of what Marxism breeds in terms of exploiting grievances, as Thomas Sowell documents, as well as the late Walter E. Williams and other scholars, you saw this kind of upward mobility, this upward trajectory on the part of colored people from the 19th century well into the 1940s and 50s. And then as this kind of cultural Marxist rhetoric, this kind of feel sorry for me grievance rhetoric began to take off with the help of the press on the part of the civil rights activists, you saw the spirit of embitterness really enter colored culture, what we now call Black culture.
As we talked about before, the spirit of bitterness didn't just enter. The spirit of bitterness was there, but it now had a platform to be made known to the world. So this is another area where Chad Jackson, I don't know if he may just not be in contact and understand the reality of the masses. And he may honestly believe this, that the bitterness came from the rhetoric of the USSR using the civil rights movement as a catalyst to conjure up the spirit of bitterness. No, Chad, the spirit of bitterness was already there, man. But we discussed that in our last session as well. But I want you all to focus thus far on this upward trajectory of business, or this alluding to this economic development of the Negroes. And juxtapose, he's going to juxtapose this to the spirit of bitterness and the right of entitlement he's explaining that black people have, and the wording he's going to use, this feel sorry for me grievance. I mean, this is just a smack in the face to the elders who struggled. But this is what he's going to bring out. Remember, this is a black face now. This is showing you that race don't matter. It's about what your values are. So let me let him finish.
And that has had an adverse effect on, again, not only black culture, but colored culture, what we now call black culture. And that has had an adverse effect on, again, not only black culture, but also the larger American society. And I'll end by saying this. When you look at the late Nikki Giovanni, who was a poet, a radical Marxist feminist, she said in an interview with James Baldwin that black folks in America, she acknowledged this, black folks in America have always been successful and have always had businesses.
Yeah, so I just want to put this together before we close. So notice the connection. The success he's making reference to, this genuine success, is black business. Okay? Black people had businesses. They were climbing the rung of success until, this is his rhetoric, until the Soviets came with their rhetoric, using the civil rights movement to instill the spirit of bitterness. And this spirit of bitterness caused a feel sorry for me grievance and a right of entitlement. And he's saying this has been the bad effects of the civil rights movement. Totally false. Okay, so I want to make this connection. He's connecting business with success and this upward mobility of so-called Negroes is in the sphere of business. All right, now keep that in mind before we close. We want to read a document addressing that. All right, so just keep that in mind for us as we look at this. All right, so just keep that in mind. Keep that in mind.
When you look at this notion of what Marxism breeds in terms of exploiting grievances, as Thomas Sowell documents, as well as the late Walter E. Williams and other scholars, you saw this kind of upward mobility, this upward trajectory on the part of colored people from the 19th century well into the 1940s and 50s. And then as this kind of cultural Marxist rhetoric, this kind of feel sorry for me grievance rhetoric began to take off with the help of the press on the part of the civil rights activists, you saw the spirit of embitterness really enter colored culture, what we now call black culture. And that has had an adverse effect on, again, not only black culture, but also the larger American society. And I'll end by saying this. When you look at the late Nikki Giovanni, who was a poet, a radical Marxist feminist, she said in an interview with James Baldwin that black folks in America, she acknowledged this, black folks in America have always been successful and have always had businesses. People can look this up on YouTube right now. She said that, however, my generation, we were not good business people. We were good civil rights people. We decided to become activists. And when you look at the fact that from around that time to today, you see this kind of widening of the disparities, gaps, and so on and so forth. And you see this kind of embracing this bitterness and the spirit of entitlement that we now have. And you look at what King was saying in the 1960s, along with people like James Baldwin and others, they were really instilling the spirit of bitterness. And this was part of the kind of Soviet propaganda program that they were implementing. And so, no, it was a complete detriment to the larger American society.
We're good.
So as we said, we're not going to look at Delano's arguments right now. We want to examine Chad's. And so let's look at this first. Before we close for this session, I want to bring this out. the American economic growth from 1900s to the 1940s and 50s, what does the data show? Actually, the economic data from the 1900s to the 1950s shows that systemically, there were no widespread measurements of economic prosperity for Black Americans. Instead, the majority of the population faced severe systemic barriers, agricultural exploitation, and the pervasive Jim Crow laws. And this. I recall my own grandparents' plight and what they told me of their experiences, and my cousins, and as we heard our grandparents speak of their plight and their journeys. So they would testify to this severe systemic barriers and agricultural exploitation and pervasive Jim Crow laws. While exact aggregate prosperity percentages are not cleanly tracked, historical and economic analysis reveal the following context. Widespread hardship. By 1900, nearly 90% of African Americans lived in the South, with almost all working in agricultural and low-wage service sectors. That is the same account my grandparents gave of their own experience. The average Black American earned only about 34% of what white persons earned, indicating that nearly the entire demographic was excluded from wealth creation. So this isn't a feel sorry for me grievance. This condition will cause bitterness. It didn't take the Soviets to cause this bitterness. It was the socio-economic conditions that the people faced that caused them to be bitter. And then the civil rights movement gave them a platform to voice their bitterness. It is this condition, not a feel sorry for me sentiment, not a feel sorry for me bitterness or a right of entitlement, but it is the desire, and it is a justified grievance because of injustice. So if we continue to look at the numbers here of the Black American economic growth from 1900 to the 1940s and 1950s, economic shifts in the 1940s during World War II, unprecedented labor shortages forced factories to hire Black Americans. So through necessity, because the young white men or the white men were off at war, they still needed the factories to run. So therefore, a larger percentage of Black people began to be able to get jobs, primarily up north, of higher wages than what they were used to, but they were still considerably low in comparison to their white neighbors. So this allowed many to move to the north. This World War II, it played a big part. But it wasn't to help the Negro. It was just to compensate for the shortage of labor of poor white Americans. Okay? So this allowed many to move to the north for better industrial manufacturing jobs. But by 1952, this transition had helped reduce the white-black earnings gap to its lowest point since 1900, but it was still a considerable wide gap with the earnings. And Fraser work, Black Bourgeoisie, gives charts and numbers to show you, no, man, it was still considerably low when you looked at the comparison with the white labor and the Black labor. And this isn't a white and Black thing. This is a social condition in which the capitalists created. Now, lingering inequality was another aspect here. So despite these labor shifts, the overall Black and white wealth gap remained profound. All right, so when we're looking at this gap, what Chad is bringing out is fallacy, and I'm not making it up myself. I'm going to read you an account. So the New Deal policies and post-war housing booms largely excluded Black families, meaning that the true economic parity and generational wealth remain unattainable for the vast majority of Black Americans as it is today. Like, you have a lot of things, diversity, equity, inclusion, and all this other stuff. And the Democrats get on there and make it seem like Donald Trump is going against Black folks and this and that. And others argue that Donald Trump is exposing how all of these benefits that were supposed to help, especially Black Americans, has not been helping them. It's been going to others. So we have to be careful on just the sources we listen to. Gather the source off the news and still look for other sources and look from the other position. All that to say is that the so-called Black American has really been stagnant. And we argue one of the reasons why it is their own fault, partly because of them not taking advantage of certain political gains. But those are other subjects. Now, with that being said, as far as this so-called trajectory and upward mobility of Negroes and success in business that Chad O. Jackson is implying, if we look at the text, number one, to challenge or to question this whole idea of success, as I was saying before, what is that? You know, have you internalized your oppressor and believe that success is just business? So if we're looking at this Black Bourgeoisie by Franklin Frazier, in his introduction on page 25, he says something very interesting. He writes, one of the most striking indications of the unreality of the social world which the Black bourgeoisie created is its faith in the importance of Negro business. This is what Chad O. Jackson is bringing. He's literally bringing what Frazier argued is a myth, that this Black business, for one thing, prospered, and that it is to be pursued for a level playing field, like Booker implied, and many of the other Black businessmen who internalized the consciousness of the oppressor, who envy the oppressor, where they argue that business is the way. Now, Frazier, again, he's arguing, he said, one of the most striking indications of the unreality of the social world, which the Black bourgeoisie created, is its faith in the importance of Negro business. And we still hear this dogma to this day, this false doctrine, this unreality. So now the tides change. Is it the Black business district who have been a detriment to the progress of America, the solidarity between Blacks and whites, by them perpetrating and continuing the values and the ways of the oppressor? Is it really them and not actually the Soviets or the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King? And what if we show you that the Soviets and the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King was more biblically based in the biblical doctrines, in the political biblical doctrines, than the vast majority of these so-called business Canaanite Philistine pursuants who claim to be Christian? This unreality of Black bourgeois business and the importance of it. So again, let me just read it through. Forgive me of the interruption. One of the most striking indications of the unreality of the social world which the Black bourgeoisie created is its faith in the importance of Negro business. That is, the business enterprises owned by Negroes and catering to Negro customers. Although these enterprises have little significance either from the standpoint of the American economy or the economic life of the Negro, a social myth has been created that they provide a solution to the Negro's economic problems. Faith in this social myth and others is perpetuated by the Negro newspapers, which represent the largest and most successful business enterprises established by Negroes. Moreover, the Negro newspapers help to create and maintain the world of make-believe in which Negroes can realize their desires and recognition and status in a white world, or more specifically, a capitalist world that regards them with contempt and amusement. It's a world of make-believe. It's a false doctrine. And this sentiment that Frazier is expressing is a sentiment we could prove by the scriptures itself. The whole theory of mercantilism, capitalism, crematistics is condemned in Bible politics. So this argument of envy not the oppressor and desire none of his ways, the weight and the depth of that passage must and needs be studied. Now we're going to pick this up further as we look into this argument of this myth, of this reality that Chad O. Jackson is trying to bring to the table, dealing with this myth of Negro business and this upward mobility. No, it actually proves it wasn't. And the text we read from Black Bourgeoisie, Most High Willing, we have a link in there for that as well. This copyright was 1957. So it was actually during the time frame in which Chad O. Jackson was making reference to. All right. So I think one who could probably speak of that time would be E. Franklin Frazier. All right. So we have to investigate this because we have to find out all of this dogma that has been fed to us and our so-called leaders who have been placed before us. They must be vetted. They must be they must be vetted and examined, and their arguments must be critiqued and analyzed with a fine-tooth comb for us to come to the truth. And whether you realize it or not, this is Bible talk. And that's why we approach the Bible from a social-political perspective, because the Bible gives the analysis of the mercantilist district, Babylon the Great, the mighty sins of the global economic and mercantile business systems, the Canaanite, which is synonymous with the trafficker, the businessman, right? So the biblical narrative continues to show the struggle between mercantilism and business and imperialism, in contrast to the struggle for freedom and liberation and salvation. And that's why you can argue, Paulo Freire says, the one who internalized the oppressor, they're afraid of freedom because freedom is conquest. And some don't have the courage to follow it. That is the conquest of liberation. As it was said by the elders, freedom is a road seldom traveled by the multitude. And then you have this sentiment where you want to delight yourself in the delicacies of the luxuries of Babylon the Great. And this is what John the Revelator brought out, the power of the luxuries of Babylon. Very intoxicating. Very intoxicating. And it causes a strong delusion. And so we got to shake ourselves out of that so we can find out the true gospel, how it's applied to this real world, and how the political gospel of the kingdom is to be applied and exercised by the saints and evangelists, following the teachings and continuing the teachings of the freedom fighters of the days of old. From Methuselah from Seth to Noah and his sons that struggle with Ehud and Samuel and Moses and Joshua, the continual struggle for liberation. This is what we're seeking, and this is the path we desire to follow. So I'm Brother Judah signing off for today's discussion. Most High willing, we're going to pick this up again. And I'd like to thank all who have taken the time to listen to us on what is to be done. And we could begin to understand that it's not about race, it's about class. Because those of your same race could internalize the oppressor. And these men before us, you have to ask, have they internalized the oppressor? All these men with so-called black faces. So again, I'm your host today, Brother Judah, and I'd like to thank all who have taken a time out to listen in to our podcast, What is to be Done. I'd like to say peace and blessings to all of you who are sincerely searching, and all of you who have an ear, let them hear.